Welcome to Golf Industry Guru and the Gig Podcast, where we interview the best and brightest golf and hospitality leaders on the planet. On today's episode, you will learn some proven real-world solutions that'll help you and your team solve some of your biggest golf business challenges. So stick around for some tips, tools, and training to get you, your people, and your business powered on. Here's your host, James Cronk.
Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another Golf Industry Guru podcast. I am your host, James Cronk, and I am thrilled to have Mr. Paul Dank with us today because we are going to talk about a fascinating topic. And I'm going to start off by telling you a little story, and I'm going to get Paul to come in and introduce himself. But, a handful of years ago, I was the board president of my club, and all of a sudden we started hearing some rumors of the membership talking about this new member that had joined our club, and wondering how we in the world let this person become a member. And we started doing a little digging, a little investigating, and lo and behold, turned out that this member had just recently got out of jail for being part of a gang. And a criminal, to say the least, and someone that's probably a bad example, of joining a family club based on the background. And of course, when they showed up with their 40 tattoos, not to judge, and a rock and roll tank top on the pool the first weekend, I can tell you our phones were blowing up as board members. And we quickly learned that we didn't have a very good member vetting process. I can tell you that. We certainly were not doing much of a background check. And really, of course, 5-6 years ago, pre-COVID, we were desperate for anyone to join the club. And I think that was the mentality that the staff had at the time. But I learned very quickly that can create challenges. And our guest today is an expert in the field, based on looking at his LinkedIn profile, of the value and the benefit of just some really good investigation. So, Paul, welcome to the Golf Industry Guru podcast. I am very excited about this topic.
Well, thank you, and I'm honored to be here today.
Paul, tell our listeners about what you do, your journey, your experience, what Kennis Member Vetting does, what your services are for the club business.
Sure. I think probably the best way to tell that story is to talk about how I ended up in this space, because to be perfectly honest, we're a corporate investigations and due diligence firm. Usually the hospitality industry doesn't have a big appetite for buying information and investigations. So it was an unusual string of events that led us to figuring out that the industry could actually use some help. And I think that we've helped to maybe bring forward a new best practice when it comes to vetting. And so we ended up in a situation where one of our clients, who works in a private equity group, contacted us and said, look, I sit on the board of this club, and the club is having some dysfunction, and you're already doing information that portrays or helps us to understand people's character and fitness for partnering and investing with. And so maybe you can help my club. And I was a little skeptical. Bear in mind, at this point, I'm now a 28-year veteran of club membership myself. I've been on the membership committee of my club twice. So I thought I knew everything, and I thought I understood things, but we ended up meeting with this GM, and the GM pretty much explained that when it comes to this process, almost anywhere in the free world in the private clubs, the applicant controls all of the information. And here's why and how. If you look at how any club does their vetting, they all sort of do it the same way. They might miss or remove one or two of the steps, but essentially there's very few steps. A lot of clubs rely on a nomination process, and they really put a lot of merit into that. And I think that that's great. The problem is society has changed a little bit, and we're nominating people that maybe haven't lived in the community for fourth generation, Everybody knows their business. Everybody goes to the same church, the same schools, right? And so what you have is nominations that are being done for reasons maybe other than lifelong friendship. I'll use myself as an example. I have a sister-in-law who asked if I would nominate somebody for membership in my club. And I said, okay, well, who is he? And she said, well, I've never met him. And I said, well, why am I nominating him? And he said, he's dating someone who's important to someone who's important to my business, right? And so when she heard that you're a member, she asked if you could do me a favor and help him in. And so I think that happens. We want it to be lifelong friendships and, godparents to the kids and sleepovers at the house and 20 years of vacations together, psychiatrist, doctor, lawyer, banker, all those things. But in reality, we often are nominating people that we don't know very well, or we're nominating people for secondary reasons. And maybe the most important point that this GM made was whatever the nomination is, either the person doesn't know anything bad or they do know the bad stuff and they're okay with it. But if you have somebody who's nominating them, it's kind of a rubber stamp. And then he walked me through the rest of the process. He said, so maybe there's an application and maybe it's even a detailed application. Although I will say from experience, a lot of clubs have a very, very brief application, but the member or the applicant is filling it out. Then you get to things like the interviews. So maybe the membership director will sit down with the people and have a conversation. Or maybe even they bring them in for a meet and greet or 9 holes and a club sandwich with a board member. And those things are great. I think that they're important, and I think that clubs should never do away with them. The problem is they're not going to get you any new information. The person knows they're being evaluated. They're on their best behavior, right? And the person that's interviewing them or spending time with them isn't a trained interrogator. They don't have a fact set of data to draw upon to figure out whether the person is lying or to lead them into traps or double blinds. And it ends up just being a process where even Vladimir Putin can make it through one of these sessions without killing anybody. And so, again, the applicant is largely in control of the information. And then one of the last steps that clubs will do is to post the name for the members for input. And I am a huge fan of this. The problem with this is it is limited for a number of reasons. If you're Paul Dank at my club, I miss 11 out of the 12 monthly emails talking about who's nominated, right? And so even if I happen upon it, oftentimes you'll find, okay, well, I know the person and I don't think that they'd be a great fit, but I don't want to offend the nominating member, or I don't want to do anything controversial. I don't want to offend anybody. I'm going to assume that others know. I'm going to assume that somebody else is going to come forward. I'm going to assume that I'm going to run into this person. What if they find out that I was the one that blackballed them? Or maybe worst of all, what if I try and blackball them by coming forward and they end up in the club anyway, right? And so there's all of these things that get in the way of people using that part of the process, even though it happens to be third party and really powerful stuff. So I love it when members come forward and say things and clubs rely on that. It doesn't happen nearly as often as it could or should. And so again, the applicant ends up controlling most of that information. And so after working with this GM and understanding the process better, he said, is there a way to introduce facts? And around the time of this happening, the world had changed in a couple of different ways. Some things that had changed really slowly was we finally had full immersion in open social practices. And when I say full immersion, I mean super seniors all the way virtually to toddlers are now fully in the game of creating information about themselves, creating information about others. We're in all the Western countries, we're very, very consumer-based, and we're super cool with companies aggregating information, collecting information about us, selling information, recording everything that we do online, right? Somebody's probably going to record this podcast that isn't you or I, and they're going to keep copies of it. And so we're now fully social, we're fully engaged, we're fully open about these things. And at the same time, we finally started to get innovation in the tools that allow us to search for all this information that's out there, all these breadcrumbs or footprints that people leave behind. And we didn't have those before. If you rolled the clock back 6-7 years ago, the best you could do is Googling, right? But Google is free. If you ever look at a heat map of the U.S. stock market, Google is this humongous component. They're a very rich, very powerful company whose product has free, unlimited use for the consumer. They still make a lot of money. They have an agenda, and yet we rely on them. I mean, could I ask, did you use Google today?
I did.
Who didn't, right? I mean, it's after lunch. Everybody's used Google. And so we're used to thinking of Google as search. And the reality is Google only indexes about 4.5% of the information that's out there. Combine that with the fact that the information, it's not growing exponentially, but it's growing really close to exponentially. And suddenly tools came out that allowed search to look and find a lot more of the footprints that people leave behind, or rather that others have left behind. And when you start to look at some of these data points, a lot of them are not helpful, but many of them do actually start to show your past and your true actions and your true behaviors. And it really opened up the idea of fact-based vetting and having clubs independently gather information to say, is there anything about the narrative that the applicant has told us that's incorrect, right? Are they starting the relationship out on a lie? And by the way, is there anything that didn't come up in the conversation that might be super important for us to know? And it really, not a silver bullet by any means, but it has really put clubs in a position to say, look, if there is information laying around openly waiting to be found, we're going to get a look at that, and we're going to be able to make sure that none of that points to us making a decision other than yes.
Paul, before we get into kind of how to do it and examples of what's out there, or experiences that you've had, or what are some best practices that clubs should be using, can we go back a little bit and talk about, you talked a little bit about the very beginning, which is why is it important for a club to even go through a vetting process of people joining a club? Let's put the gangster example aside, as maybe a rarity, maybe not a rarity. And by the way, gangsters are people too, and should be able to play golf and swim and have their kids play hockey. But at the end of the day, what is the, clubs, like you said in the old days, a club, you joined a club to hang out with your friends of like-minded people with like-minded thinking, like-minded activities. And you formed a little club and you participated together and you did social things together. Now, as we know, clubs can have micro little cosms of groups within a club and cliques within a club, different ethnicities in a club that play or participate together. All kinds of clubs are sharing that challenge these days of silos and how to bring people together and how to get people to use the club from a social aspect, as opposed to just a transactional process. So how does vetting play a part and an important part in just a club's culture, I guess, in your experience?
Well, it's a great question. It's funny. I have been fortunate to have the opportunity to speak to various chapters of CMAA. And through that process, I often get to hear the other speakers. I always get to see the agenda, right? And building culture is tremendously important. Most of the members are rowing in one direction. And one of the beautiful things about having a private club is you join it because of that culture. And if there are people that are, let's eliminate people who are a danger and a threat, but people who are just not going to fit. And I think anybody who's listening who has club experience knows there are people that join the club. It isn't right for them. They don't last long, and it usually isn't a great, fun experience for everybody while they're figuring that out on their way out the door. And so when clubs have an opportunity to see behaviors and associations that point to something other than a good fit, they can act on it ahead of time. And if you think about it, no matter where the club is situated and whether it's privately held or a corporate club, the best time to eliminate the problem is at the onset. It is far more dramatic, painful, and expensive to remove someone from a club than it is to bar them entry. So clubs really get to see and have access to information to verify that the person is a good fit. And again, that the narrative that they've provided about themselves and their reason for joining the club and who they are and what they bring to the club, you have a lot more facts upon which to rely, as opposed to saying, well, we had the nomination and they made it through the meet and greet and the application's okay and no one spoke up when we posted the name. So that means it's going to be a good fit. And if you think about it, I have a club in the Northwest, not too far from you guys. And that club, they have their idea of decorum. And that idea of decorum probably wouldn't work in Central Texas. And it certainly wouldn't work in parts of Florida. And, if they see someone who clearly has a lot of different behaviors and ideologies, and they can determine that ahead of time, they can help make better decisions. And you can take somebody who fits perfectly in one environment, put them in another environment, and they are, quote, toxic, right?
I wonder if this question that I'm going to ask you is combined into two parts, because when I think of you talk about fact-based vetting, right?
Yep.
And I want to hear about what that is. And then at the same time, how do we not discriminate? How do we not, how do you walk that line or that path? How does that work in the world of, first of all, from a club standpoint, from a legalese standpoint, because I can tell you that when we went through the process of removing that, convicted gangster from our club, there was a lot of conversation around the legal rights of the club, about the discrimination, about, what was the rights of that particular club and their bylaws and their constitution and their policies, what was allowed to be done, not allowed to be done, allowed to be said, not allowed to be said, what reasons could be given, what reasons couldn't be given. It was a nightmare, not to mention it cost a few $1,000s in legal bills. So can you touch on, if you can, both of those wide-ranging kind of areas, Paul?
Yeah. So first things first, I'm not an attorney. This isn't legal advice, but what I am pretty good at is paying attorneys. And before I decided to really move forward with a line of business here, devoted to this, I paid a couple really good silk stocking firms to take a look at what we were doing and what clubs are doing. And I can't speak for every country where you've probably got listeners, but what I can say is, there are certain rights to assemble. And if you look at truly private clubs in the United States, for example, you can have a club and set it up for any reason you want, and it's protected and you have the right to do it. So I'll give you a positive example. Mensa, right? The Association for Geniuses. No matter what.
That's an application. I've sent in 4 times. They haven't accepted it, but anyway, keep going. I'm sensitive to that topic.
Yeah, they have good judgment, and we share that common loss. So, listen, as much as I might want to be a member of Mensa, and I might say, I have the right to, they have the right to say, no, we're going to establish it, and we're going to set up our criteria. And our criteria is determining that you are a genius based on the scale that we want to use. And that's good enough, and you can't sue them and say, you're discriminating against me because you formed an association or club and you set the terms. We can flip it around and look at a negative example, right? The American Socialist Workers' Party. Well, that's the Nazis. The Nazis are allowed to set up a private association. They can discriminate, if you want to use that term, by saying, we're going to set the criteria for membership here. You have to come from a very small slice of society. Oh, and by the way, you have to engage in hating everybody else and planning evil things. And they have the right to do that. So clubs have the right to determine what their culture is. As truly private clubs in the United States, they don't actually have to follow a whole bunch of laws that apply to public domain. So, for instance, the American with Disabilities Act is something that a store or a restaurant, a business has to adhere to. There's no ways around it. A private association could actually be set up for the sole purpose of discriminating against disabled people, and it's allowed to exist, and it's allowed to bar people from entry. In the club world, there is a concern sometimes that private clubs are sometimes a little bit public, right? So they have 3 public events a year, right? Or on Monday mornings, they open up to the public for golfing, and they cross that line and they are no longer protected. Well, here's what you still have to do. You still have to discriminate. So if someone doesn't meet the criteria to be in the club because the personality is a bad match, or there are behavioral things in their past that the club doesn't like and doesn't fit, that's different than discriminating. I think where clubs run into the anxiety is when, what if I have someone who falls into a protected class and they're a jackass and we don't want them? And it has nothing to do with their protected class. And that can be the diciest part of all of it. I will also tell you this, at least in the United States, no one has managed to challenge a truly private club and demand their way in through a discriminatory action. It has not happened in truly private clubs. So again, they're allowed to cross the line. I will also tell you this. I don't care where the club is located. I have yet to run into a club where they have any interest in discriminating against anybody. And so optics probably matter. And the fact that all of the rest of society is held to that standard, right? It puts the clubs in that anxious position of saying, gosh, the person isn't, for lack of a better term, a white male. And so we could potentially have exposure that we're being discriminatory. If the club isn't discriminatory in their practices, they're going to be just fine. And they should have a basis that they can defend.
We'll get back to our conversation in a moment. But first, are you ready to learn from the world's greatest golf and hospitality industry leaders? Train your team and grow your business with a membership to Golf Industry Guru. Join for less than $3 per day and give your entire team access to over 150 hours of courses, podcasts, webinars, templates, articles, live Q&A calls, and more. Free content samples and registration details at golfindustryguru.com.
So then why does a club need to hire someone like yourself to do member vetting? What are the reasons why people call you? Because I know they do. And what are the reasons why your phone rings? And when you get a call from a club manager, and you explained that one, the first one that you had previously from a corporate client, when you get a call from a club manager, Paul, can you just share with our listeners, like, how does that conversation go? Like what tell me how that conversation, generally speaking, goes, if you can.
Oh, absolutely. So I think what clubs are starting to realize is that their current processes leave them in just as bad a strait as they could be. They can still run afoul of any time they say no to someone that it's perceived as being discriminatory. And the reality is they realize that the applicants control all the information, and they're really making decisions in the dark largely. They are hoping and praying that the nomination is based on some real hard knowledge and ethical behavior. And that isn't always the case. If you combine that with the fact that the world has never been more transient and people have never moved around more, and there has never been as big a transition within wealth than there has been in the last 20 years. You're now seeing people that didn't grow up in clubs, that aren't living in the same community. They moved someplace new. They're strangers. And clubs have picked up, and we can elaborate on this, but they've picked up on the fact that having money doesn't inoculate you from idiocy or worse. And there are problem people that have means and resources and not looking at as many facts as possible in your decision making actually goes against what a U.S. legal standard called reasonableness. Is it reasonable for the clubs to not do any vetting? And then what's the answer to that question if, God forbid, something goes wrong and a member does something really bad? A member hurts someone, right? The first thing that's going to happen, just like in these horrible events that happen out in the world that end up on TV, right? Someone shoots a bunch of people at a movie theater, whatever the tragedy of the moment is. The very first thing the media does is pulls apart that background. And they start looking for fact-based information. And oftentimes they will do what? They'll lay out a chronology of increasingly dangerous behaviors. You know, we can go on and on about this point, but I think people sometimes will say, well, we haven't had a problem at our club. And so things like that are distasteful and they don't happen here in our community. I would argue, no, your lottery number just hasn't been called yet.
Yeah. If you put enough club managers together in a room and you ask them to tell stories about, you know, would they have preferred to have done a better job of vetting before letting Mr. or Mrs. Smith or whoever it might be, you know, join the club, you're going to get some stories. You're going to get some significant stories. So Paul, let's now walk us through how you do fact-based vetting without giving up your secret sauce. But well, tell us, so how you answer that club manager, you say, well, you know, you can engage our services and let me show you what we do. We'll tell you what we do.
Perfect. So one of the steps that I left out in the process that some clubs have adopted is to do some kind of a basic background check, right? So you talked about you had the situation where you had a criminal who someone with a criminal past that came into the club, and that had you known that, you probably wouldn't have said yes. That's a component that's out there right now. I think the biggest hurdle has been the vast majority of the companies that provide background screening are doing what we call FCRA regulated background checks. The FCRA in the United States is the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And it even though it says credit reporting, it still has to do with a couple things. It not only is the extension of credit, but it also deals with housing and whether or not you will rent to somebody. And then it also has to do with employment. And it's actually a really good law. And I think almost every, if not every state in the union has adopted a state version of that law. But what it says is there's a limited number of things that you can look at, and they have to be things like criminal convictions, right? And they have to be official driving records. And that you can only make decisions based on convictions and official things like that. And for lack of a better term, it's really small ball, and it strips the context out of things. And it also says there are things that you can't consider. So, for instance, I think a pretty easy question to answer is, do you think an employer or someone offering up housing has a right to determine whether or not you get the job or that house predicated on what church you go to? You think that's a good idea? Well, in the club scenario, what if I told you it's the Church of Satan and I'm a Wiccan and that's what I'm engaged in and that's the behavior? Right. Not going to work in the club environment, right? And clubs don't have those standards. So they've been sort of stuck with a background check, which, by the way, if you're doing them, it's better than not doing them.
Right.
The reality is most people don't get out of prison, spend a year, kicking around, and then decide to drop $60K on a golf club and find someone who's going to nominate them. It usually doesn't work out that way. So it's almost like an ICBM. You're glad you have that silo off in farm country in case you ever need it. The problem is clubs aren't actually really limiting the population because there's so few people that have those kinds of criminal records, right? Who can also afford to get into a club. And so what we've done is we've enhanced that. Because clubs are allowed to look at more information, context matters. And I'll give you a great example. I use this one all the time. We had somebody who applied as a single middle-aged guy on the East Coast. He applied for membership at the club, and a couple of days after applying, he bopped back into the club and wanted to stop in to see the membership director, and he wanted to inoculate the situation. And so he said, hey, listen, I wanted to tell you, a couple of years ago, I had a party and things got loud, and just so you know, the cops were giving me a terrible time, and they wouldn't give me a break. And I ended up with a misdemeanor disorderly conduct ticket, if you can believe it, at a fun social party. So terrible cop, dumb thing. I just wanted to tell you. And so we could tell where this is going, right? He knew that if you did a traditional background check, you might find that. And he wanted to explain it away ahead of time. So in a traditional background check, that's all you can look at is the conviction. It's one disorderly conduct. It's a misdemeanor in the States. It's not a big deal. The problem was the actual event that took place. The actual event was a party at his house, and the police were called. But the police were called because he was observed pulling a woman out of the open window of her car by her hair and refusing to let her leave. That's why the neighbors called the cops. When the first officer gets there, the woman is gone, but the applicant is there, and he's very tuned up, and he's ready to go. And he explains, you're a rent-a-cop. I make more than you make in a year in 5 minutes. I know the governor. I'm going to have you fired. Get off my property. I'm going to kick your ass. And it gets really bad. So bad that the officer hits the officer in distress button on his vest. More officers come. The situation ends up with him having to be put in manacles and laid on his belly. He's spitting at the officers and trying to fight them. Well, what happens with people of means when they get into trouble? When they end up getting into trouble, what do? They muster resources and hire great lawyers, and they get 7 different criminal counts reduced to 1 misdemeanor.
Wow.
The point is, if you look at the context and you look at all of the data that's available on that conviction, I don't want him in my club. And I can't think of any situation where if a year and a half or 2 years prior to application, that's how you're behaving, you're going to be a good member of the club. And so we look at those records. And the other thing about public records, and if people don't know what that means, it means literally records held by public entities, usually involving some kind of formal dispute or some kind of formal regulations. We're going to look for those wherever people leave footprints. And these CSI television shows, although highly entertaining, give people the idea that in 2 clicks of a mouse, you can know everything about a person, and you simply can't. And so on the public record side, we're not only looking further and deeper because we're allowed to into those public records, but then it's the flip side. It's looking at all of the open source information and all of those breadcrumbs and footprints that we leave behind as social, open, free people. And that's really where we've seen the biggest change. It's, you didn't post anything and it's unstructured data. It doesn't actually have your name connected with you, but I'm using 9 different facial recognition platforms, and we find posts of you, and it turns out that you're in a go-go bar in Bangkok with 2 steamrollers in your lap. Right?
Oh, that was you were just giving an example. I thought you were, busting me there, Paul.
You have never been to Bangkok. But the idea.
First of all, there's nothing wrong with the go-go bars in Bangkok. I'll tell you that, number one. But number two is that besides, members pulling people's hair and pulling them out of a car, what are the red flags that a club what are the red flags that you discover that you pass on to a club and say to them, hey, this is in our minds, this is a red flag that you should pay attention to, right? So obviously criminal convictions or like the story you just gave, a great example. But what are some of the other red flags that a club should be aware of that would possibly lead to, once again, a poor fit with an individual?
So good question, fair question. The reality is Kennis doesn't make recommendations of yes or no, nor do we engage in trying to interpret the information. What we do is we provide the information. And so I'll give you an example. I have a number of clubs where this kind of behavior would not work, but this was a person in their late 20s, got nominated by someone on the board. because they had started a business. They were doing business with this board member's company successfully. The board member liked the person. But what we found is two things. We found quite a bit of older misogynistic content that this person had created and racist content that this person had created. Now, interestingly, the club is in the Southeast, and they saw the information, and it was sort of early on in the Kennis platform. And I had a conversation with the GM a couple of weeks after we submitted our report, and I said, I was curious, what did you guys end up doing? And he said, well, here's the deal. I think, Paul, if I had eliminated anybody who in their youth had that bravado and that kind of maybe that kind of upbringing, I'd probably have about half my members gone. And he said, so what I did was something different. I sat him down and said, by the way, this is all out there, number one. And number two, that has to be part of your past. And this is not the club where I want you power drinking and jumping off cabana roofs in the pool or hitting on members' wives or mistreating the staff. And if you hold on to any of those beliefs, then this isn't the club for you. And essentially let the person in and put them on, sort of double secret probation and use the information as a yellow light instead of a red light. That same decision would never be made at any of my clubs in California. It would be a hard no. And so when we talk about the culture, right, and who the population and the composition of that club is, I think that they all end up looking at things a little bit differently. I don't think anybody would have a hard time with the member who was that out of control and knowing he's going to come into the club and drink. So one of the adjustments for clubs once they start getting this information is sometimes there's going to be brand new situations put in front of them. I'll give you one of the biggest areas. You had asked about some examples of red flag areas. Oftentimes what we want to do is we want to be perceived one way and we want to truly behave differently. And so what do we want to do? We set up ghost social media accounts. And because we're amateurs and we're not good at this, we often get caught, and guys like me can find those accounts. And so when you want to troll people or you want to fat shame people or whatever it is that really needs to come out of you that you want to express, and we find those accounts, that can be very enlightening. So that's probably one of the most alarming areas that we find information where clubs are like, oh dear God, who is this person? Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I had one the other day, which I got a phone call, and the person has an X account, and the only thing that they do on the X account is solicit naked photos from, I'm assuming most of these are bots and not real women, but that's all we do is we openly solicit naked photos from people all day long. That's where his mind is at.
For those that are listening in the future, in the last couple of days on the news has been an example of inappropriate use, I guess would be the best way to say, of a shared communication app called, I use the example that, my kids come home from school and tell me about the person that came in and, said, I can in a computer within 2 minutes, they can find everything about that kid's social media activity as much as they've got it hidden behind passwords and all kinds of stuff. And I know you're talking about that. Paul, in the United States, for example, does politics ever play a role in kind of the vetting that clubs want to do as far as that culture piece? Does that ever come up? Is it really about kind of, the bad things that people are doing, and people are doing bad things on social media? And as you say, you've got technology that can, that stat you just gave about Google was unbelievable. I'd never heard that before, which is fascinating about what you're saying in the sense that there's all this information that's out there in the world that unless you're experienced at digging for it or finding it, you're not going to get access to it. So is politics kind of playing a part right now in the country that is so divided 50-50?
Oh, I would certainly think so. For instance, I have a club that is very conservative, and they're in a place where they like oil, and they like cows, and they like guns, and they like being left alone, and they like low taxes, and they like the police. And when I know for a fact that they will not find it to be a good fit if you are anti-police, anti-guns, anti-oil, and anti-cattle. And it's a social club, right? We don't always want our country clubs to be perceived like fraternities and sororities, but that's very much what it is. I watched a documentary, and you may not have heard of it. It's not necessarily popular, but it talks about one component of social life in sororities at the University of Alabama. And at Bama, some of these old row sororities are considered the prize for a Southern belle to get accepted to. And it talks about what these girls who are trying to gain entry into this, and bear in mind, these are sororities at a public institution, right? There's actual coaches that they hire to help them fit the optics that will allow them to be accepted by that group. I don't know of any country clubs that are this catty, and that's probably a good thing. But the idea is your club does get to set the standards. And if there's someone who's not going to fit because of their beliefs and it's going to be a miserable experience, clubs don't have to accept that. And I think one of my earlier examples is behavior in one place would be considered appropriate, and in the next place it would be considered toxic and horrible and unspeakable. And so clubs really have their own standards, but for the first time they get to look at independent information and not rely on the applicant, right? To determine whether or not that is a no or a conversation. And sometimes the conversations work great, where you just set the tone for the relationship. I've also had GMs report back. I pointed out who we are, and I pointed out where I think they are, and that maybe this isn't a great fit and maybe they should withdraw. A byproduct of doing fact-based vetting is once the membership knows and they start making those nominations, they can make those nominations and assure the applicant that I'm nominating you, but the club has its own process. And they sometimes say no. And I don't have a say in that. And you know what happens? If it's probably not going to work out, and you know that at the onset, or if you're in trouble, you're going to go down the road to the next club. Yeah. So it's this kryptonite effect, right?
Before I ask my kind of final question, I think about how clubs can have you help them. What for a club that is what are 2 or 3 or 4 kind of best practices in the member vetting process that every club should follow, that is looking to ensure that the people that join their club are the best fit possible?
Yeah. So I think that one of the easiest is to, and I love this because I've seen this at a few clubs now, where they ask the nominating member a lot of detail about their relationship with the person. How long have you known them? Have you been to their home? Do you know their family? Right? Can you provide some context for your nomination? And that makes for a stronger nomination. I think clubs should also be realistic about their members. If your worst member is nominating someone, you should probably ask more questions than you might if it's your best member, simply because you have people that oftentimes want to promote their values and their beliefs and their behaviors. And so I think that that's a good idea. I love it when clubs have a somewhat lengthy application where they're asking details about people, because that gives us a much better footprint to fact check against. And clubs need that. If you didn't ask any questions, you shouldn't be surprised that there's a whole bunch of things you didn't know about the person when they show up on day one. And I think that helps. I also think that if a club isn't soliciting the membership for input, that they should adopt that as a practice, and that it shouldn't have a very short window. I have seen some clubs that have 5 days to respond right from the posting. It really doesn't give members a lot of time to deal with that. I also think that it's a good practice if someone has been in another club to verify that. and to verify that they were successful members. And here's why, and I'm sure you can appreciate this. If someone has succeeded in the club environment someplace else, the chances of them succeeding at your club are phenomenally higher than if they've never been in a club. Right. I think they're just people that join clubs who aren't ready for it and don't understand it, and then they get there and they're let down and they're unhappy and they want to change everything and they end up leaving anyway. So being able to verify that somebody was a good member and succeeded in the club really speaks well to a candidate. Don't give legacies, or your community the credit with being above bad behavior. Bad behavior comes from a variety of reasons. I could spend time just talking about mental health and the number of people that have undiagnosed, untreated mental health issues. Here's what I'm going to tell you about mental health. Everybody empathizes, but when you're at the club and a fellow member humiliates you in front of a whole bunch of people, ruins your club experiences, or decks you, you really don't care why. You would just be really happy if they hadn't been in the club. And it, frankly, if you're dealing with one of those issues, maybe isn't the right time for you to be in a social club. So, long-winded answer, sorry.
No. It's a fantastic answer, Paul. Fantastic answer. Any other thoughts to share?
No, just, I can't tell you how great it is working with clubs. In my business, I spend a lot of time with risk managers and attorneys and, finance people. And it's all, damage control. And, it's really refreshing to work with clubs. And, everybody that works in the industry is fantastic. The mindset is fantastic. They're just natural pleasers and type A's. And it's really phenomenal to represent clubs and help them. And the stories that we're getting about the clubs that have been with us for a while now, it's the same. I don't want to call it a broken record because it's a great record. They talk about how the experience is getting better within the club, that it's easier to build a culture when you have people that are there for the same reasons and want to be there, and are all in and altruistic with the participation. And so we like to be a component to help them and to reduce risk at the same time.
Paul, can you cross borders? Do you also work in Canada and the United States?
So we offer parts of our service in outside of the U.S. The open source, looking for information and footprints, we're able to do that for clubs outside of the U.S. The reality is the United States has the most open public record system that there is. I mean, you go to states like Florida, every record about everything that you do is saved forever and it's free. We have some states that are a little more restrictive, but in Canada, you guys have a narrower interpretation of privacy, which limits some of that information about your formal footprints, right? So yes, we can help. We just can't help maybe as deeply as we can here in the States. Same with in Australia, we can help. Just, and then you get to countries like Germany and things like that where no information is public.
Right. Paul, how do our listeners get in touch with you? What's the best way for them to learn more about you? I assume reaching out to you on LinkedIn or but tell me more.
Yeah. So LinkedIn, our website is really easy, membervetting.com. So if you look up my name, Paul, there's not a lot of Paul Danks in the world, and membervetting.com is the quickest way to get to me. So love to have conversations with anybody that's interested.
Awesome, Paul. So much, so good. It's such an interesting topic. It's such an interesting process. There's no doubt in my mind, and certainly in my travels, that clubs have become so much more in tune with the challenges that happen to their culture when they allow people to join their club that aren't onboarded effectively, right? Whether it's just going through the vetting process, whether it's setting standards from the very beginning, whether it's understanding why someone wants to use the club and making sure that you can deliver on that promise. And the vetting process is just part of it. So, ladies and gentlemen, Golf Industry Guru listeners, thank you so much for joining us. What a great topic. Reach out to Paul to learn more. Reach out to Paul to have him help your club vet members, go through an exercise. I'm sure you will not regret it whatsoever. And Paul, thank you so much for your time today. All the best. And as always, ladies and gentlemen, we will see you on the inside.
Thanks for listening to the Gig Podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode and mostly that you learned a few things that will help you improve your business. Join us next time as we continue to bring you the best and brightest golf and hospitality leaders on the planet. Thanks for listening.